I've surveyed broken land my whole life. Cracked earth, dead creek beds, fields that gave out like a man who'd been asked to carry too much for too long. I've seen farmers weep into soil that wouldn't take seed. I've seen ranchers shoot their own cattle rather than watch them starve slow. I've seen men walk away from 100 acres without looking back, because looking back costs something you can't always afford. But I had never, not once in 31 years of wandering the frontier, seen a woman release 200 chickens into a dying wheat field like she was setting something sacred loose. I had never watched a field that was actively collapsing, roots pulling up, topsoil lifting in sheets, the grain going gray at the crown, reverse itself slowly over the course of 6 weeks because of birds. Birds and stubbornness, birds and grief, birds and a kind of knowing that doesn't come from books or county extension offices or the men who ride through in clean boots offering advice nobody asked for. Her name was Della Running Waiter. She was 34 years old. She had buried a husband, a crop failure, and a language that her own children were starting to forget. She had $40 to her name and a piece of land that the county assessor had already written off in pencil. And she had 200 chickens. What happened next, I've tried to put into words a dozen times. I've drawn the maps. I've marked the dates in the margins. I've gone back and forth about whether what I witnessed was farming or stubbornness or something older than either of those words. I still don't have a clean answer. I arrived on the Running Waiter claim on a Tuesday in late April, carrying a transit level, a canvas satchel full of surveying stakes, and a commission from the Territorial Land Assessment Office that I hadn't wanted to take. The commission was simple on paper. Verify boundary markers, confirm acreage, note any improvements or deteriorations to the land since last assessment, file report within 30 days. What it meant in practice was that I was the man they sent before they sent the other man, the one with the foreclosure papers. I was the warm-up act for dispossession. I'd done it before. I told myself each time that the report was neutral, that I was only recording what was already true, that the land's condition wasn't my fault and neither was the county's decision about what to do with it. I told myself a lot of things on long rides. The Running Waiter claim sat in a shallow valley about 14 miles east of the town of Corda, New Mexico territory, in a region that had been called promising by the wrong people for about 15 years running. The soil was what old-timers called stingy. It would give you 1 or 2 good seasons if you worked it right, and then it would make you earn everything else the hard way. The previous owner, a homesteader named Garrett Finch, had broken it for corn and then abandoned it when the water table dropped. The claim had passed through 2 more sets of hands before Thomas Running Waiter had filed on it in 1887, bringing with him a Mescalero Apache wife, 3 young children, a small herd of mixed-breed cattle, and apparently an unusual confidence in stingy soil. Thomas Running Waiter had died of a burst appendix in January of 1891, 14 months before I arrived. I knew that from the file. I also knew from the file that the woman, his wife, Della, had continued farming the claim alone, with help from her eldest boy, who was 12, and periodic assistance from a neighboring Apache family whose name the file spelled 3 different ways. The file noted, in the detached tone those files always used, that the 1892 wheat crop had failed, that the 1893 planting was in progress, that 2 payment installments on the land note had been missed. The file didn't note what that looked like from the inside. I saw it from the outside first. Coming down the last slope before the valley, I pulled my horse up and just looked for a minute. The field was roughly 40 acres, running east to west along the valley floor. At a distance, it had the gray-green color of early wheat, the kind of tentative color that means the crop is alive but not yet committed. But there was something wrong with the texture of it. The rows weren't right. They had a patchy, interrupted quality, like a sentence written by someone who kept stopping mid-word. And the soil between the rows, what should have been dark and close, was lifting. That's the only word for it. The topsoil was lifting, separating itself from what was underneath, turning pale at the surface in irregular patches the size of wagon wheels. Wind erosion, but worse than I'd seen in this valley before. The homestead itself, a low adobe house, a plank barn, 2 pole corrals, sat at the western end of the field. Smoke from the chimney. A line of laundry, signs of life at least. I rode down. She was in the field when I arrived. I didn't see her at first because she was crouched between rows, and the wheat, such as it was, blocked my line of sight from horseback. I tied my horse at the corral post and walked to the field edge, and that's when I spotted her. A small woman in a dark work dress and a wide-brimmed hat, moving slowly along a row, stopping every few feet to crouch and look at something close to the ground. Her youngest child, a girl of maybe 5 or 6, walked behind her, carrying what appeared to be a jar. The older two were nowhere in sight. Maybe at school, maybe working somewhere else on the property. I stood at the field edge and waited. I didn't call out. Something about the way she was moving made me not want to interrupt. She was looking at the soil, not at the wheat plants themselves, but at the soil between them, picking up small handfuls, letting them sift through her fingers, pressing the heel of her hand flat against the ground and holding it there. She did this 4 or 5 times along the row before she straightened up and turned toward me, and I realized she'd known I was there the whole time. "Elias Cobb," I said, because it seemed important to lead with my name rather than my function. "From the Territorial Assessment Office." She looked at me for a moment. She had a broad, still face, the kind that doesn't perform its thoughts for observers. Brown eyes that were slightly narrowed, which I would later understand was habitual, not suspicious. Her dress was clean despite the fieldwork. The small girl behind her peered around her hip at me with open curiosity. "You're early," Dela running waiter said. "I expected you in May." "Schedule moved up," I said. That wasn't entirely true. The schedule hadn't moved, the bank's patients had. "I can come back." "No," she looked back at the field for a moment, then back at me. "Come in. I'll give you coffee and you can tell me what you're actually here for." I followed her to the house. The small girl fell into step beside me, still carrying her jar, which I could now see contained a collection of beetles, 3 or 4 of them, black and iridescent, moving against the glass. She held the jar up toward me without saying anything. "Good ones," I said. She considered the question seriously. "I don't know yet," she said. "Mama says you have to watch them first." The coffee was strong and the kitchen was clean, and there were 3 different things drying in bundles from the ceiling beams, plants I didn't recognize, with a smell that was sharp and vegetable and faintly sweet. Dela put the coffee in front of me and sat across the table and looked at me with that narrowed, assessing gaze, while her daughter released the beetles onto the table and watched them walk. I explained the assessment. I was professional about it. I'd had enough practice. I explained that it was routine, that I'd be checking boundary markers and making notations, that the report would go to the office and they'd be in touch. I did not explain what "in touch" typically preceded. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "The north fence line has moved since the original survey. Thomas moved it 3 years ago because the original stakes were wrong. The creek shifted." "I'll note that," I said. "I'd like you to note it accurately," she said, "not approximately." "Understood." There was a silence. The beetle on the table reached the edge, and she set it back in the center without looking at it. "The field," I said. I hadn't meant to bring it up yet. I'd planned to lead with the boundary survey neutral work before I got to the harder observations. But the field was sitting in my head from the moment I'd come over that slope. The topsoil separation, how long has that been happening? She looked at me differently then. Not warmer exactly, but with a kind of attention that felt more mutual. "Since February," she said. "After the freeze broke and the wind came up. This valley has always had wind. But last winter was drier than usual, and the ground..." She paused. "Thomas used to say this soil has a short memory. It forgets how to hold itself together if you don't remind it." "What does reminding it look like?" "I'm working on that," she said. I spent the first 3 days on the boundary work. It was honest labor, methodical, physical, the kind that tires you in a clean way. I checked stakes, measured distances, weighted the creek at 2 points to confirm where it now ran versus where the original survey said it had run. Dela was right about the north fence line. Thomas had moved it, and he'd moved it to the correct position. I noted that. While I worked, I watched the farm the way I always watched things, peripherally, in sketched impressions that I'd add to the margins of my survey notes later. The 2 older children, a boy named Hector and a girl named Rosie, who I guessed at 10, did chores in the morning, and attended a schoolhouse 4 miles east in the afternoons, riding a small paint pony with enormous patience for being ridden double. The youngest, whose name turned out to be Pima, followed Dela everywhere and conducted what appeared to be an ongoing scientific study of everything she encountered, including me. Della herself worked from before sunrise until after sunset. I don't say that to make a point about hardship. I say it because the quality of the work was remarkable. She didn't move quickly. She moved with a deliberate, considered pace that covered more ground than it looked like it should. She was in the field every morning for 2 hours before the children were up, walking the rows, examining the soil, doing that thing I'd seen on the first day, crouching, pressing her palm flat, lifting a handful and letting it fall. Taking notes, sometimes, in a small book she kept in her apron pocket. On the third evening, she showed me what was in the book. We were sitting on the porch after supper. She'd fed me without making a ceremony of it, which I appreciated, and she brought out the book and laid it open on the table between us. It was filled with diagrams, not art exactly, more like maps. She'd sketched the field from above and marked different zones within it with symbols I didn't immediately recognize. Some zones were cross-hatched, some had small circles, some had arrows indicating wind direction. The cross-hatched areas are where the topsoil separation is worst, she said. These 3 zones here, the circles are where the wheat is still holding. The arrows are the prevailing wind vectors this spring. Thomas and I tracked them for 4 years. I looked at the map. It was, I realized, genuinely sophisticated, not in a formal agricultural science way, but in the way of someone who had been paying very close attention to one piece of ground for a long time. What's causing the worst separation in these zones specifically? I asked. Several things, she said. The corn stubble from the previous owners wasn't fully broken down when Thomas first planted wheat, so the root structure underneath is uneven. The wind hits hardest from the northwest in spring, and these 3 zones are the most exposed. And she hesitated. The soil chemistry. Thomas had a theory about it. He said this soil was missing something, that it had been worked hard without being given back anything. Organic matter, I said. If the previous owner was running corn without rotating. Yes, she looked at me. Do you know about soil? Some, I said. I've surveyed a lot of farms, you see patterns. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her map. Then she said something that I wrote down in my own notebook that night, because I wanted to make sure I got it right. Thomas believed that this land wasn't broken, she said. He believed it was tired. There's a difference. Broken things don't come back. Tired things do if you give them the right kind of rest. On the 4th morning, I got up early and went to use the outhouse before the household was stirring, and I found Della already in the yard, standing at the gate of one of the pole corrals. In the corral, there were chickens. Not a farm's normal complement of chickens, not 20 or 30 birds scratching around a coop. There were dozens and dozens of them, crowded together in the pole corral in the gray pre-dawn light, making a collective low sound that was almost musical, a constant murmuring conversation. I stood and counted roughly. I lost count twice. I guessed somewhere between 150 and 200. Della was watching them. She had a cup of coffee in both hands, and she was watching the chickens the way she watched everything, with that particular focused attention, that slight narrowing of the eyes. How many? I said. 212, she said. Give or take, some of the hens have been laying in unusual places. Where did they come from? She was quiet for a moment. Some were ours. Thomas started the flock 4 years ago. He had 40. I increased it last year. The rest I traded for over the winter. She paused. 3 different families, some Apache, some not. I traded cattle mostly, some cured hides, some of Thomas's tools that I didn't need. I looked at the corral. 200 chickens. I thought about the cattle, the tools. I thought about what you had to believe about a plan, about a piece of land, to make those trades in winter with missed payment notices in your files. What are you going to do with them? I asked. She turned and looked at me with that assessing expression. I'm going to put them in the wheat field, she said. I want to be precise about my reaction, because I think it matters. My first thought was, that will destroy the wheat. 200 chickens in a 40-acre wheat field. They'd scratch, they'd eat. They'd uproot young plants and compact soil and create chaos. Everything I'd read, the agricultural bulletins, the extension pamphlets, said chickens and grain fields were incompatible. You kept chickens away from grain, not in it. My second thought, arriving maybe 10 seconds later and less clearly, she knows this field better than any bulletin does. I didn't say either of those things. I said when. When it's right, she said, not yet. I finished the boundary survey on the 5th day and wrote my preliminary notes. I had enough to file a basic report, boundaries confirmed, modest deterioration of topsoil in approximately 30% of field acreage, main structure of homestead in fair condition, livestock count within assessed parameters. What I didn't know how to write was what I actually thought, which was that something was happening on this claim that the report form didn't have a category for. I could have ridden back to Corda. My commission was technically complete. The boundary survey was done. What remained was the overall land assessment, the estimation of current value, the notation of improvements or decline, and I could have done that on the basis of what I'd already seen. The field was struggling. The topsoil separation was real and significant. An honest assessment would have to note that the crop yield for 1893 was seriously in doubt. An honest assessment would have accelerated what was coming. I told myself I stayed because I wanted to complete the work properly. I told myself I needed more data on the creek behavior. I wrote these justifications in small, tidy notes in the margin of my survey book, and I did not examine them too closely. What I actually did was stay, because I wanted to see what DeLa running waiter was going to do with 200 chickens and a dying field. On the morning of the 7th day, Hector came into the field at sunrise, the older boy, 12, Thomas's face and DeLa's eyes, carrying a long piece of rope. He went to the far eastern end of the field, near where the topsoil separation was least severe, and he began marking off a section. Not large, maybe a quarter acre. He drove small stakes at the corners and strung the rope between them. I watched from the edge, pretending to take measurements. DeLa came out an hour later with Rosie and Pima. Between them they were carrying what I can only describe as a chicken-moving apparatus, a series of lightweight wooden frames covered in wire mesh, hinged together so they could be folded flat for carrying, and then opened into enclosures. They set these up along the edges of the roped section, forming a rough temporary fence. Then they went back to the corral. The noise when they opened the corral gate was immediate and operatic. 200 chickens discovered freedom all at once and expressed their feelings about it at full volume. DeLa and the 3 children moved them with practiced efficiency, directing the flow, gently blocking certain paths, keeping the surge headed toward the eastern section. And within about 20 minutes, they had perhaps 30 or 40 birds contained in the roped enclosure. They closed the wire frames. They went back for more. It took most of the morning. By the time they'd moved all 200 birds, shuffling them in groups, maintaining a loose rotating system that I gradually understood was deliberate. The eastern section of the field was a seething, murmuring mass of birds. The noise was extraordinary, the smell was strong. The ground inside the enclosure was already transformed. Every surface scratched and turned, the pale topsoil crust broken open, dark earth showing underneath. Pima stood beside me at the field edge, watching. "They're looking for bugs," she said. "Are there bugs?" She gave me a look that suggested this was not a sophisticated question. "There are always bugs," she said. "Mama says the bugs are why the soil is sick, or not sick, unbalanced. She said the bugs that should be there aren't, and the bugs that shouldn't be are, and the chickens will sort it out." I looked at the field. "Your mother thinks chickens can sort out the soil biology." Pima thought about this with great seriousness. "She thinks they'll start the process," she said. She didn't say they'd finish it. DeLa came and stood beside us a few minutes later. She was breathing harder from the work of the morning, but her expression was the same, focused, quiet, giving nothing away for free. "They'll stay in this section for 3 days," she said, without preamble, as if we'd already been in the middle of a conversation. "Then we move them west. The section they leave, we water it and wait." "What are you expecting to happen?" I said. "The scratching breaks the topsoil crust," she said. "The droppings, fresh, concentrated, they'll add nitrogen and organic material to the surface. The birds find and eat the larvae that have been destroying the root systems. They also eat the weed seeds that have been establishing in the bare patches." "You've researched this." "My grandmother grew corn," she said. "She moved her chickens through the field in segments. She called it. She said something in Apache that I didn't know. I don't have a word for it in English, something like clearing or waking, making the soil remember what it was supposed to do." She looked at the birds in the enclosure. The field around them, the sections they hadn't yet reached, was still gray and fragile-looking, the topsoil still lifting in the morning wind. But the section they were in was visibly different already, alive with motion, darker. "Will it work?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, she said, "Thomas thought this field had a short memory. I think it has a long one. I think it remembers everything that's ever lived on it. I think it's waiting to be reminded." She went back to check the wire frames. I stood at the edge of the field for a while longer, drawing the chicken enclosure into the margin of my survey map, which was not in my commission and not part of my job. But some things you have to mark down, even when the form doesn't have a category. The first evening after the chickens went in, something happened that I haven't written anywhere until now because I couldn't figure out how to put it in a document without it sounding like something else. I was sitting on my bedroll in the barn. Dela had offered me the spare room, but I preferred the barn. I always preferred the barn. It's a quirk I've never fully explained to anyone, and I was adding notes to my survey book by lantern light. The chickens were quiet. The wind had died with the sunset. The valley was very still. I heard Dela's voice from the direction of the field. Low, not loud, rhythmic. I thought at first she was talking to someone, to Hector maybe, making late checks on the enclosures. But when I came to the barn door and looked, I could see her standing at the field edge alone, just at the boundary of the roped section, and she was talking to the field. Or not talking exactly. It was something between talking and singing, and something else that didn't have an English name that I knew of. She had her hands at her sides. Her eyes were open, looking at the wheat. I went back to my bedroll and didn't come to the barn door again. I wrote in my notes, "Her relationship to this land is not what I was sent here to assess." I underlined it twice. In the days that followed, the movement of the chickens through the field took on a rhythm that I found myself tracking without being asked to. 3 days in each section. Move west. Water the vacated section. Note what changed. Dela moved through these days with a kind of focused intensity that was different from what I'd seen at the start of my visit. Not more urgent, more concentrated. She was watching everything. She was in the field before the children were up and after they were in bed. She was taking notes in her small book constantly, kneeling in the vacated sections and pressing her palm to the soil, reading something in the texture and the temperature that I couldn't read but was beginning to understand she could. Hector worked beside her without complaint and without much conversation, the quiet, efficient style of a boy who had inherited his father's roles while still being required to be a boy. He was careful with the wire frames. He moved the birds with patience. Once on the 4th day, I saw him crouching in a vacated section with his hand pressed flat against the ground, exactly the way his mother did, and staying there for a long time. I was adding that margin note when Rosie appeared beside me, seeming to materialize from the air, which was her habit. "He does it because he wants to know what she knows," Rosie said. "Will it work?" I said, "learning it that way?" "She learned it from her grandmother," Rosie said. "Her grandmother learned it the same way, hands first, then words," she considered. "Hector's hands are pretty good, his words will catch up." By the 10th day, the first 2 sections, the ones the birds had cycled through, showed something I hadn't expected to see so soon. The topsoil crust in those areas was not lifting. I don't want to overstate this. The wheat plants themselves hadn't visibly changed, it was too early for that, but the surface of the soil was different, denser. Darker where the bird droppings had been incorporated, and the lifting, that pale, fragile separating quality that had been the field's most visible problem, was absent in those sections. The soil was lying flat, staying. I knelt in one of those sections and pressed my own palm to the ground. I don't know what I expected to feel. What I felt was dirt, damp, worked, populated dirt, normal dirt, the kind of dirt that didn't feel like it was thinking about leaving. When I looked up, Dela was watching me from 12 feet away. "Well," she said. "It's holding," I said. She nodded once, the way she nodded at things that confirmed what she already knew. Then she went back to directing Pima's somewhat chaotic chicken management efforts in the next section over. I stayed in the field for a while, kneeling in the dirt with my survey book open and no particular notation to make, listening to the noise of 200 chickens working their way west through a field that had been giving up. It was, I thought, the loudest kind of hope I'd ever witnessed. On the 12th night, a hard wind came down from the north. I woke up in the barn when I heard it hit the valley. The sound of wind in this terrain is particular, a low, sustained pressure that builds before it breaks. I lay on my bedroll and listened to it find the gaps in the barn planks and whistle through, and I thought about the field and the chickens and the sections that were finally holding. By morning, I already knew something had happened. The eastern sections, the ones the birds had finished with, had been hit by the wind while the enclosures were down. They were moved each night to prevent the birds from roosting in them. And the topsoil. I stood at the field edge in the early gray light and looked. The eastern sections had held. The soil that the chickens had broken and turned and deposited on, it had stayed. Some damage at the edges where they bordered the sections not yet treated, but the main area was intact. The untreated western sections, the part the birds hadn't reached yet, had not held. The wind had lifted new swaths of topsoil, 3 or 4 new bare patches, pale and raw-looking in the morning light. Delilah was already there, standing at the border between the treated and untreated sections, looking west at the new damage. I stood beside her and didn't say anything. After a long moment, she said, "We need to move faster." "The birds are only a third of the way through," I said. "Yes." Another long silence. She was looking at the damage with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, not defeat, exactly, but something in the same neighborhood. The exhausted recognition that the problem was larger than the solution, and the solution had to stretch anyway. Then she turned around and went to the barn to get Hector. The rest of part 1 ends here, not with resolution, but with a decision being made in the practical, exhausted way that real decisions are made. By turning around and getting to work before the light is fully up, before anyone has said aloud what the stakes are, before hope has been named so it can be taken from you. The wind had drawn a line. On one side, what the birds had done. On the other, what still needed doing. Delilah Running Waiter walked back toward the barn with her eldest child's name in her mouth and the cold spring air around her. And I stood at the field edge drawing the 2 kinds of soil in my margin map. One held, one lifting, and writing the date beside it. April 29, 1893. Wind came last night. The field is half held and half not. This is where the real work begins. There's a way of working that I can only call driven, not frantic, not desperate in the surface way, but driven the way a river is driven, by something underneath the visible current that doesn't show but determines everything. That's how Delilah Running Waiter worked in the 2 weeks following the north wind. I want to put down what those 2 weeks actually looked like, because the accounts that get written about frontier farming, the ones in newspapers, the ones in settlement pamphlets, always flatten it into something picturesque or something tragic, and the thing I was watching was neither. It was granular and exhausting, and occasionally funny and frequently mundane, and it required a kind of decision-making that never looked dramatic from the outside, but was, I gradually understood, absolutely relentless on the inside. We, and I say we because I had by that point stopped pretending my involvement was neutral, moved the chicken rotation from 3-day sections to 2-day sections. This was Delilah's call, not mine. She worked out the math on a scrap of paper at the kitchen table the morning after the wind, dividing the remaining field into sections, calculating bird days against remaining acreage, factoring in the condition of the western sections, which were worse than the eastern ones had been. 2 days per section, she said. We cover the field in 12 more days. We've lost 3 sections on the east side that we'll have to redo. That adds time, I said. Yes, the growing season. I know, she said, not sharp, not dismissive. Just I know. Already calculated, already carried, already decided to move forward anyway. What the shortened rotation meant in practice was more movement, more labor, more management. The chickens needed to be contained, monitored, moved, and moved faster, which meant the sections were smaller, which meant the birds were denser in each area, which meant the scratching and turning was more intensive, which was, Delilah said, intentional. In the bad sections, we need more impact, she said on the second morning. More scratching. The crust is thicker where the wind took the most. It needs more disruption to break it. Hector, who had a practical engineering mind, built 2 additional wire frame sections in the evenings using wood from the old corn crib. Rosie took over management of the daily water schedule. The sections after the chickens left needed watering to help the droppings incorporate, working the pump, and hauling in a pattern that she apparently calculated herself. Because when I asked her about it, she explained it to me in more detail than I'd expected from a 10-year-old. You water 2 days after the birds leave, she said. Not before because the soil has to settle, not 3 days after because the top dries out again. 2 days. How do you know that? Mama tried different timing last fall with the kitchen garden, she said. 2 days worked better. It keeps the moisture from, she frowned, looking for the word. From going only down, it goes sideways too, into the loose parts. I wrote that down. Capillary action, explained by a 10-year-old on the basis of empirical observation in a kitchen garden. Around this time, something else was happening that I only understood fully in retrospect. The birds were returning things to the field. Not just droppings, though those were significant. Not just scratching, though the disruption of the crust was measurable and visible. What the birds were doing as they worked their way through section after section was introducing a kind of activity to the soil that it had been without. Motion. Disturbance. The constant small puncturing and turning and scratching that breaks compaction, that aerates, that mixes the surface layers together. And the insects. Pima was tracking this. She had her jar. She'd moved on from beetles to a broader portfolio of specimens, and she was collecting from the sections before and after the birds worked through them. She showed me her collection one evening with the seriousness of a natural historian presenting findings at a symposium. These are before, she said, indicating a small jar with 4 or 5 specimens. These are from the 6 sections before the chickens. I looked a handful of larvae, pale and fat, a few tiny beetles, dark-colored. These are after, she said, indicating a second jar nearly empty, 1 or 2 survivors. The chickens ate most of them, I said. The ones that were hurting the roots, she said. But also, she produced a third jar which had considerably more activity in it. Smaller beetles, darker and faster moving, some kind of small millipede, something I couldn't identify. These are also from the after sections. These weren't there before. I looked up at her. These came from somewhere else. Or they were always there but hiding, she said. Mama says that when the wrong bugs go, the right bugs come back. She says the soil has to be... Again the frown of someone looking for the right English word for something that exists more precisely in another language. Invited. The right bugs need to know it's safe. I wrote in my notebook, P. Says right insects return after disruption of harmful population. Consistent with soil biology literature, competitive displacement in microfauna communities. She is describing this from observation. Below that I wrote, the family is doing soil science. They are doing it without the word. The Apache neighbors arrived on the 4th day of the accelerated rotation. I had known there was a neighboring family. The file had mentioned it, misspelled 3 ways. What I had not fully understood was the relationship, which was not exactly neighborly in the frontier sense of people living nearby who helped with harvests. It was more intricate than that, and I spent some time trying to understand it. The family, 4 adults, 2 older children, 1 grandmother, arrived on horseback with tools and with food and with no particular announcement or ceremony. They set down what they'd brought and went to work. 2 of the adults went immediately to the field, where they seemed to understand what was being done with the chickens without being told, or to have been told before I witnessed the telling. 1 older woman went to the kitchen and began preparing something with Rosie, who clearly knew her. The grandmother sat in a chair in the yard with a small child asleep in her lap, and watched everything with the alert, satisfied attention of someone who has arranged things to be watched. I observed all this from the periphery, which is where I try to stay when I haven't been invited in. That evening, sitting outside after supper, Della came and sat beside me on the step, which was unusual. She didn't typically sit still in the evenings. She typically used the last light for more work. They came because you're here, she said. I'm sorry, I said. From the assessment office, she said. They heard, they know what it means. She paused. They came to help finish before the report is filed. I sat with that for a moment. The knowledge that my presence, my very official, neutral data-gathering presence, was the thing that had catalyzed an Apache mutual aid network into arriving with tools and food and labor. That the report I was supposed to be writing was, to these people, a countdown. I haven't determined the timing of the report, I said. No, she said. But you will. Another silence. The evening was cooling. From the field, the sound of the chickens in their nighttime enclosures. How did your husband come to file on this claim? I asked. Not because it was relevant to my survey. Because I was sitting on a step in the dark and the question was sitting with me. He was half mescalero, half Kansas cattle hand, she said. He could talk to anyone and make them think he was one of them. The land office agent thought he was a white man who'd got a tan and a peculiar wife. She said this without bitterness, in a matter-of-fact tone. He believed in this valley. He said he'd seen this soil in its good years. He'd driven cattle through here in 1884, and the grass was green to your knee in April. He said the land remembered that. He wanted to give it a chance to remember. He believed what you believe, I said. He taught me what I believe, she said. Or, she paused. No, he said the same things my grandmother said in different words. That's why I listened. She stood up and went inside. I drew the valley in my margin that night from memory, the outline of the hills, the flat line of the field, the little X marks where the chicken sections were. I drew it 3 times because the first 2 didn't look right, and the third one I drew the house too small, which meant the field was too large, which was wrong in scale but maybe right in some other way. The next 10 days were the hardest and the most legible. Legible to me as a bystander. I mean that the progress became something I could actually chart. Each section the birds cleared changed in a way I could now read. I had stopped pretending I was doing survey work and had started doing something closer to documentation, though I didn't call it that. I walked the sections every morning before the chickens moved. I pressed my palm to the soil. I noted texture, color, the presence of absence of that lifted, fragile quality. Section by section, from east to west, the field was staying. Not recovering, I want to be precise. The wheat plants themselves were not yet visibly transformed. The growing season was advancing and the crop was thin, and the yield projections in my head, which were the kind of projections the assessment office would want to see, remained grim. Thin wheat, sparse wheat. 40 acres of wheat that, by any honest accounting, would produce well below what a viable farm needed to sustain a land note. But the soil was staying. The topsoil was holding. The field, which had been in the process of dismantling itself, returning to dust, returning to nothing, undoing years of work in the particular heartless way that wind and degraded soil do, was no longer doing that. It was possible, not certain, but possible, that the 1893 crop would be a failure that left behind a recoverable field rather than a failure that left behind a ruin. That distinction doesn't sound like much, but it is the difference between a farm that can be tried again and a farm that cannot. On the 16th day, something went wrong. I want to tell this accurately because the instinct is to narrate around it, to place it as a dramatic setback that leads directly to triumph, and it wasn't quite that. It was smaller and more specific, and in some ways more devastating than a dramatic setback. 111 chickens died overnight. Not from disease or not primarily. The night had been cold, unexpectedly cold for mid-May, and the chickens' enclosure in the southwestern section, the section with the worst wind exposure, had failed. A wire frame had come loose, the birds had scattered in the dark, and when the temperature dropped, the ones that hadn't found shelter had. Hector found them in the morning. He came into the barn where I was still half awake and said, in a voice that was working very hard to be level, "Mr. Cobb, I need help counting." We counted 111. I went with Hector to where Dela was standing at the edge of the southwestern section, looking at what remained. About 90 birds still alive, clustered in the surviving enclosure sections, making quiet sounds. The dead were in the field itself, scattered and still. Dela stood and looked for a long time. She had her small notebook in her hand, unopened. Then she said, "We need to bury them in the field." Hector made a sound, not quite a protest. The sound of someone very young absorbing something very difficult. "In the field," I said. "Bury them in the ground in the sections we haven't finished," she said. The decomposition will," she stopped, closed her eyes for a second, opened them. "They'll still feed the soil, it won't be what I planned, but they'll still do work." There was a silence. "Mama," Hector said, quietly, just that word. She looked at him. Something passed between them that I can't describe accurately because it wasn't performed for anyone watching. She put her hand on his shoulder for a moment, one moment, and then she said, "Get the shovels." The burying took most of the morning. All of us, including the Apache family who had been there since day 4, who came to the field without being asked and picked up tools without being directed, and worked alongside in the particular focused silence of people who know when not to speak. Pima did not come to the field that morning. She stayed in the house with the older woman from the neighboring family, and I could see them through the kitchen window. The child at the table, the older woman beside her, both bent over something I couldn't see. Later, I found out Pima had asked to catalog the remaining beetles from the sections the dead birds had worked through. The older woman had helped her. She had, apparently, continued the work that needed continuing. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The girl who collected beetles, continuing to catalog specimens on the morning when her mother's plan had lost half its instruments. Not ignoring the grief, I don't think she was ignoring it, but holding it in one hand while continuing the work in the other. The family had that quality, all of them. Not hardness, it wasn't that. Something more like an understanding that the farm couldn't wait for grief to finish, and grief couldn't wait for the farm to finish, and so you had to carry them simultaneously, which is maybe the thing they don't tell you about farming, or about any sustained, effortful thing. You don't do it after the hard parts. You do it through them. In the afternoon, after the burying was done, I sat at the edge of the field and added up the math. 91 birds remaining, roughly 12 sections left to cover. At the current density, the remaining birds could adequately cover maybe 7 or 8 sections at full intensity, and the rest at reduced effect. I wrote this out in my notebook with the neat, dispassionate hand I use for numbers I don't want to feel. The field would not be fully covered. The worst sections, the southwestern ones, the ones with the heaviest topsoil damage and the least organic material, would get reduced coverage or none. The impact there would be incomplete. I was still looking at these numbers when Della came and sat beside me. She had been in the house for an hour. I'd seen her go in after the morning's work, and she'd washed her hands and face but not changed her dress. She looked at my notebook. "You've run the numbers," she said. "Yes, and—" I told her what I'd calculated, plainly the way she seemed to prefer things. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The southwestern sections, the worst ones, I'm going to pen the birds there for 5 days instead of 2. Concentrated. It won't be the same as a full pass, but it will be more than nothing. They'll strip the remaining wheat plants in those sections," I said. "The wheat in those sections isn't going to yield anyway," she said. "I've known that since April. I'm not farming those sections for this year. I'm farming them for next year." This was, I understood then, what she had known for some time, and I had only just caught up to. She wasn't trying to save this year's crop. The crop, the 1893 wheat, had been in doubt since February, and she knew it. What she was doing with the chickens and the sections and the careful rotation was something different. She was farming the ground for the years after. She was treating a failed crop as the price of a recovered field. I sat there for a moment, recalibrating everything I thought I had understood about what she was doing. Then I said, "The report I'm writing." "I know," she said. "It will have to note the crop condition honestly." "I know." A pause. The late afternoon light was hitting the field sideways, and the sections the birds had worked through looked different in that light, darker, more textured, more alive-looking than the sections at the western end. "The note is due," she said. It wasn't a question. "End of the month," I said. "That was 11 days. She nodded once, stood up, went back to the field. On the 20th day, the neighbors from the eastern side of the valley arrived. Not the Apache family, a different group. Settlers, a German family named Brecht who farmed about 6 miles east. And then, 2 days later, a man named Oscar Tully who ran cattle on the adjacent range and had heard, somehow, through the network that transmits information across frontier distances with efficiency I've never fully understood, what was happening at the running waiter claim. Oscar Tully was a man of approximately 70 years who wore a hat that had been new around the time of the Mexican War. He walked the field sections with Della for about an hour, saying nothing, just looking. Then he went back to his horse and got down a canvas bag that he'd tied behind his saddle and that I hadn't noticed, and he gave it to Della. "Compost," he said. "Saved it all winter. Wife said I was being peculiar." The canvas bag contained what appeared to be a carefully saved and dried collection of organic material, kitchen waste, stable cleanings, something that smelled like aged manure and sawdust. A year's worth of compost from a man who had apparently decided, for reasons he didn't explain, to save it carefully against a possible need. Della looked at the bag, then she looked at Oscar Tully. "You knew," she said. "I didn't know anything," he said. But my grandfather told me never to throw away good dirt. He shrugged, resettling the old hat. Figured someone would need it eventually. He stayed for 3 days and worked without being asked to and left without making any ceremony of it. The Brecht family, mother, 2 adult sons, a daughter-in-law, brought seed. Different seed. A turkey red wheat variety they'd brought from Germany, which Dela had apparently heard about but never grown. They also brought food, which was more immediately useful, because by day 20 Dela's larder was running in that thin-before-the-harvest way that frontier larders ran. I noted all of this in my survey book, not because it was relevant to the boundary measurements, because it was the most important thing happening in that valley. The thing about collective action, and I've thought about this in the years since that April and May, is that it doesn't arrive at the beginning. It doesn't arrive at the planning stage, or the dreaming stage, or even the early optimistic stage. It arrives when it arrives at the point where one person has gone as far as one person can go, and the situation is still unresolved. The Apache family came when the official machinery of dispossession showed up in the form of me and my transit level. The German family came when the news traveled 6 miles east, through whatever frontier telegraph system carries news of that kind. Oscar Tully came because his grandfather had told him to save good dirt, and he had, and someone needed it. None of them came to rescue Dela running waiter. That's an important distinction. They came because they were part of the same fabric, and the fabric was under strain, and strain in one place is felt in others, and when you feel that kind of pull, you pick up a bag of compost or a load of good seed and you ride. What Dela had built, over 14 months of farming alone, of trading cattle for chickens over the winter, of keeping her children on that claim and working that field and talking to it in the evenings when no one was supposed to be listening, was not just a farm in distress. She had built something visible, something that people could orient toward. Whether it would be enough was still, on day 20, genuinely unknown. On the 22nd day, I filed an extension request with the Territorial Assessment Office. I wrote that boundary confirmation had revealed a dispute between the original survey and current creek position that required additional on-site verification. This was true. I had noted the discrepancy. I did not mention that the discrepancy had been adequately documented on day 5. I did not mention that the additional on-site time I was requesting was not for surveying. I sent the request with a rider going east and told myself I was being professional. I was not being professional. I was buying time. I was buying time for a woman who had released 200 chickens into a failing wheat field because her grandmother had called it clearing or waking, and because she believed, with the specific patient stubbornness of someone who has decided to believe something all the way, that the soil had a long memory and just needed reminding. Whether that belief was warranted was what I was staying to find out. The 23rd day, the southwestern sections, after 5 days of concentrated bird work, showed the first visible change. It was not dramatic. I want to be clear about that. The change was not the dramatic kind. It was the kind where you have to know what you're looking at to know you're looking at anything. The topsoil crust in the worst of the southwestern sections was disrupted. Not healed, disrupted. Broken open. The pale, lifting quality was still there at the edges, but the interior of the worst section had been scratched through, and the dark soil underneath was showing, and the bird droppings and the compost that Oscar Tully had contributed, and the careful watering schedule that Rossi maintained were doing something together that none of them could do individually. The soil was receiving. That's the word I keep coming back to. It was receiving what was being given to it. It wasn't fighting anymore. The compaction was breaking. The chemistry, and I'm no agronomist, I was working from instinct and observation, seemed to be shifting. The smell of the southwestern section was different from the smell of the section beside it, the one that hadn't been worked. Less dry, less empty. I pressed my palm to the ground and held it there. Dela came and stood behind me. "Well," she said. "It's receiving," I said. There was a pause, then she said, "Yes." Just that word, no more. But when I looked up, she was looking at the section with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not triumphant. She wasn't a triumphant person, not in that loud way. Something quieter. The expression of someone who had said something true a very long time ago and has just finally been believed. Part 2 ends here in the middle of things, where real progress usually lives. Not at the end of the struggle, not at the resolution, but at the moment when the soil went from fighting to receiving. At the moment when one woman's decision to believe in a long memory field began, provisionally, slowly, with 11 days left on a land assessment extension, and a report yet to be written, to be confirmed. The southwestern sections were not healed. The crop was not saved. The note was still due. But the soil was receiving. The soil was no longer leaving. That was something. That was the first something that had not been there before. The last week of May in that valley comes back to me in fragments, not in the clean narrative order I usually prefer. I've been a surveyor for 31 years, and I think in lines and measurements and the orderly accumulation of facts into findings, but the last week of May 1893 at the Running Waiter claim doesn't arrange itself that way when I try to remember it. It comes back in images, smells, a few sentences spoken by different people that I wrote in my book and have carried since. Here is what I have. Day 25. Dela, Hector, and 2 of the Apache neighbors are in the field at 6 in the morning before the light is fully up, walking the rows. Not the chicken sections, the rows themselves, the planted rows, examining the wheat. I'm at the fence line. I can see even from that distance that they're pointing at things, that the conversation involves excited gestures. I go to the field edge and Dela looks up and says, without preamble, "Come see." I walk to where they're standing in the middle section of the field, an area the birds covered in the second week. The wheat here is thin, by any standard thin, but the roots. Look at the roots, Hector says, and he's crouching beside a plant he's gently lifted at the edge, not pulled, lifted. The way you lift something you want to examine without destroying, and the root structure is showing, and the roots are. They're going deeper. The roots of the wheat plants in this section are penetrating further into the soil than they should be able to, given the condition I'd observed 3 weeks earlier. The soil disruption, the breaking of the compaction crust, has opened pathways. The roots have taken those pathways. The soil remembers, Hector says. It's the first time I've heard him say it in exactly those words. He says it as a fact, not as a quote, as something he has determined independently. I crouch beside him and look at the root. It goes down further than my fingers can follow. Day 27. The report extension runs out at the end of the month, which is 3 days away. I have been adding observations to my survey notes for 27 days, and the observations now comprise 4 times the content of a typical assessment report. I sit at the barn table in the evening and look at what I have written and try to determine what an honest report contains. An honest report contains topsoil erosion in approximately 40% of field acreage at assessment commencement, with partial to substantial remediation in progress across approximately 60% of the affected area. Wheat crop for 1893 expected to yield below viable threshold. Field condition trending toward improved long-term viability, contingent on continued management practices. An honest report also contains the management practices in question are being undertaken successfully. The field is not in a state of irreversible decline. The claim is actively and competently managed. An honest assessment of the claim's value is: this land is worth more than it was 3 weeks ago because of what one woman has done to it, and any assessment that does not note that is dishonest. I write 3 drafts. I throw 2 of them into the lantern. Day 28. Pima finds me at the fence line in the afternoon carrying a jar. "Mr. Cobb," she says, "do you want to see the after ones again?" I look at the jar, more specimens than before. The small beetles, the millipede relatives, other things I still can't name. Active, moving against the glass. "There are more than last week," I say. "Lots more," she says, with the satisfaction of a scientist whose hypothesis is being confirmed. "The ones in the sections the birds finished earliest, the eastern sections, there are even more there. A lot more, and different kinds." "Your mother's theory," I say, "about the right bugs coming back." "She didn't call it a theory," Pima says. "She just said it would happen." I look at the jar for a while. Then I say, "Pima, when you're older, do you want to farm this land?" She considers the question with full seriousness. "I want to know everything about it first," she said. "All the parts, the soil parts and the water parts and the bug parts and the wind parts, then I'll know what to do with it." "That's a scientist answer," I say. "Mama says the land tells you what to do," she says. "You just have to know how to listen." She takes her beetles and goes back to the house. Day 29, the final territorial assessment deadline. I had asked for and received one extension. I had no grounds for a second. I sat in the barn in the early morning and wrote the report. The real one, the one that would go in the file. I wrote it as accurately as I could, boundary markers confirmed, creek position noted with correction to reflect current alignment, structure condition, livestock count, crop condition. For the crop and field condition, I wrote, topsoil erosion documented at assessment commencement has shown measurable reversal across approximately 55–60% of affected acreage through active remediation. Root development in treated sections shows improved soil penetration consistent with restored organic matter content. Crop yield for current season will be below viable threshold. However, field condition assessment indicates capacity for viable production in subsequent season. Contingent on sustained current management. Current management assessed as active and competent. For the overall assessment, I wrote, this claim is in productive operation under competent management and shows evidence of improving long-term soil viability. Assessed value reflects current season crop shortfall and should be weighed against demonstrated field recovery trajectory. It was not a glowing assessment. The numbers were what they were. But I had written the truth, which was that this was a claim in the process of being saved, not a claim in the process of being abandoned. Whether the bank would read it that way was not my call. I folded the report, addressed it, set it by my pack to go with the next rider east. Then I went to the field. Delau was there at the eastern end, walking the first sections the birds had covered. The sections that were almost 30 days into recovery. She was moving slowly, stopping every few feet in the way I'd seen her move on the first morning I arrived. I walked beside her without saying anything. The wheat in these sections was thin. I want to be clear and honest about that. It was not a good crop. Any farmer looking at it with clear eyes would see a yield that would not cover the land note, that would not represent a profitable year, that would not impress anyone with the farm's current performance. But the wheat in these sections was growing. Real growing, root-deep, soul-connected growing. Not clinging to a failing substrate, actually growing in soil that had been reminded of what it was for. The difference, if you knew what to look for, was everything. We walked the length of the first section. Delau pressed her palm to the ground twice, a habit by now, a daily habit for both of us, though I was a poor substitute for 30 years of knowing a particular piece of ground. "What are you going to do when the report gets to the bank?" I said. "What can I do?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was more like a statement of the shape of the situation, clear-eyed, without performance. "The assessment notes the recovery trajectory," I said. "I know, you told me last night. The bank will weigh the current yield against." "I know what the bank will weigh," she said, not sharp, just I know I have known. I have been doing all of this knowing. We stopped at the end of the section. The sun was fully up now, hitting the field sideways in the morning way that made the thin wheat glow slightly, the green more vivid against the dark soil. "Thomas used to say," she said, and then she stopped and was quiet for a moment. She said his name rarely. Less rarely than when I'd first arrived, but still rarely, each time with the particular care of someone who has learned to carry a heavy object properly. He used to say that this valley was in between, not good land, not bad land, depending land, that everything here depended on what you did with it. "Depending," I said. "He meant it as a good thing," she said. "He meant the land's fate depends on the farmer, not fixed, not decided, depending." She looked at the field for a long moment. "I want it to still be depending," she said. "When my children's children are here, I want it to still have the capacity to be better or worse based on what you do. Not gone, not decided, still depending." The bank letter arrived 14 days after I sent the assessment report. I know this because I stayed. I had no commission reason to stay. I'd filed the report. My work was technically done. But I was camped in the barn and no one had asked me to leave, and I had a feeling about the timing that I couldn't explain professionally. The letter came with a writer from Corda, a young man who gave it to Delau at the kitchen door and waited with visible discomfort for her response. She read it at the kitchen table while I sat across from her, and Pima cataloged beetles beside the window, and Rosie stirred something on the stove that smelled like onions and cornmeal. She read it once, then again, then she set it flat on the table and looked at it. "Well," I said, They're offering a restructured note, she said. Extended terms, lower monthly payments for 2 years than a balloon at year 3. She paused. The assessment report, the trajectory notation, they cited it. I waited. It's not forgiveness, she said. The debt is the same. I still have to produce a viable crop next year or we're back to this conversation. But you have time. I have 2 years, she said. 2 years to show viable yield. I looked at the report, the bank letter, I mean. The formal language of financial institutions that had decided, on the basis of a surveyor's notation about recovery trajectory and competent management, to extend rather than foreclose. It wasn't generous. It wasn't charity. It was a bet that the recovering field would recover fully, and the bet was being placed because someone had made a compelling enough record of what was happening to the field that the bet seemed reasonable. I had made that record. I wasn't going to say that to Dela, but I noted it in my survey book later, in the smallest writing I use for the things I want to remember accurately. Field assessment testimony contributed to restructured financing. 14 days between report and decision. The trajectory notation was the deciding factor per the letter's language. Below that, in even smaller writing, I told the truth. Sometimes that's what surveys are for. That afternoon, Dela went to the field without the chickens. Just her, not Hector, not Rosie, not Pima. She went alone, and I watched from the barn doorway as she walked the full length of the field, east to west. From the earliest treated sections, the ones almost 30 days into recovery, all the way to the southwestern corner where the worst damage had been, and where the 5-day concentrated bird session had done its incomplete but genuine work. She walked it slowly. She stopped many times. She crouched at different points and pressed her palm to the soil, and the gesture that had seemed ritual when I first observed it on that first morning now seemed to me like something more practical than ritual. A reading, an ongoing conversation, a form of information exchange between a woman and a piece of ground that had been in dialogue for 6 years. When she reached the far western end, she stood still for a moment, facing west, facing away from me. Then she turned and walked back. She was looking at something as she came back, not at me, not at the barn, at the field itself, at the sections she was passing through. And gradually, as she drew closer, I could see what her expression was doing. I've tried to describe this before, and always ended up using inadequate words. Not joy, joy is the wrong register, too bright, too uncomplicated. Not relief, relief implies a simpler danger than what she'd been carrying. Something in between those, and also something underneath them, a quality of recognition. Of something being confirmed that she had believed and been uncertain about, and chosen to act on anyway. The field was holding. Not completely. Not in all the places she'd hoped. Not in the catastrophic southwestern corner, which would need another full season of rebuilding. Not in the thin, pale rows of the 1893 wheat, which would produce inadequate yield and would have to be acknowledged as a failure year. But in section after section, east to west, across most of the 40 acres of stingy valley soil that Thomas Runningwaiter had believed in and that Dela Runningwaiter had traded cattle for chickens to save, the ground was holding. The topsoil was down. The roots were reaching. The bugs that were supposed to be there were coming back. She walked back through the field and she saw all of this, and her face was doing that thing. That evening, Hector came to find me in the barn. He stood in the barn doorway with his hat in his hands, a gesture so adult, so learned, that I had to remind myself he was 12, and he said, "Mama wants to know if you'll stay for supper." "Tell her yes," I said. He started to go, then he stopped. "Mr. Cobb," he said, "the report you wrote. The part about the recovery." "Yes." "Did you write it because it was true, or because you wanted to help?" I thought about how to answer this. I thought about the 2 drafts I'd thrown into the lantern. I thought about the accuracy of what I'd observed and the equally accurate thing I'd observed beside it, which was what one family was doing on a piece of land that had almost decided to give up. Both, I said, they were the same thing. He considered this for a moment. Then he nodded, put his hat on, and went back to the house. Supper was the Apache neighbors and the Brecht family and Oscar Tully, who had heard about the bank letter the way he'd heard about everything, through whatever frontier telegraph existed in that valley, and had arrived with another bag of compost and the manner of a man who happened to be passing through. The table wasn't large enough. Pima sat on a stool. Rosie served from the stove with the efficiency of someone who had been hosting large meals since she was 8 because necessity had required it. Hector sat beside Oscar Tully, and the old man talked to him about grass, specifically about how to read grass, how you could tell what a piece of land had been, and what it could be again from the way the grass grew at its edges. And Hector listened with the same full, gathering attention he'd been giving everything since the morning he'd found the dead chickens. Della sat at the end of the table and ate and occasionally spoke and watched her children, and the watching had a quality I recognized from those long days in the field, the same focused, receiving quality, taking in what was in front of her. After supper, the adults sat outside. Oscar Tully told a story about his grandfather that went on for 40 minutes and was primarily about a stubborn mule, but was clearly about something else. One of the Apache men told a story in Apache that the grandmother translated in fragments, with editorializing. The Brecht daughter-in-law sang something softly to herself in German, while her husband fell asleep against the porch post with his hat over his face. It was ordinary. It was the specific ordinary of people who have been through something together and have arrived, temporarily, on the other side. I left 2 days later. I had packed the night before, in the quiet way I've always packed, rolling things efficiently, making sure my survey instruments were secure. I had my report filed and my extension notes complete. My professional business was unambiguously finished. In the morning, I tied my horse at the corral post and went to the barn for my pack, and when I came out, Della was there. She was holding something, a small cloth sack, tied at the top. She held it out to me. "From the field," she said. "One of the early treated sections, topsoil." I took the sack. It was heavier than it looked. "It's the good kind now," she said. "I wanted you to have some of it." I didn't know what to say to that. I thought about several things and didn't say most of them. What I said was, "I'll be back for the next assessment. 18 months, likely." "I'll be here," she said. "The field will be different," I said. "Yes," she said. "That's the plan." I put the cloth sack in my saddle bag, alongside my survey instruments. Then I rode out of the valley, up the slope I'd come down 32 days earlier, and when I got to the top I pulled up because I always pull up, and I looked back. The field was visible from the top of the slope. 40 acres of thin, recovering wheat in the morning light, green-gray and patchy and genuinely, demonstrably alive. The dark patches where the soil was rich and turned and receiving. The pale patches still at the edges where the work wasn't finished. No chickens visible, they were in the far corral. No people yet, it was early. Just the field and the homestead and the valley, and the stingy soil that had decided, provisionally, not to give up. I've filed 5 subsequent assessment reports on the running waiter claim. I have the dates in my book. November 1894, field and viable production, 1894 wheat yield meeting land note requirements. Note restructure proceeding per terms. May 1896, field assessed at substantially improved condition from 1893 baseline. Topsoil integrity restored across approximately 85% of original affected area. Hector running waiter identified as co-manager. 1898, Della running waiter has implemented a seasonal chicken rotation as standard practice, 30 to 40 birds through a field section system. Land note current. Pima running waiter has established what I can only describe as an ongoing soil biology study, the findings of which she has shared with 2 neighboring farms. 1900, I told the assessment office I had a conflict of interest on this claim and recommended a different surveyor. I'm not sure they understood what I meant by it. The last note in my survey book from the running waiter claim is not from an assessment. It's from a letter Hector sent me in 1902, when he was 21 and running the farm with his mother and had, apparently, through some combination of his own determination and Pima's connections, submitted a description of their soil management system to an agricultural journal in Santa Fe. The letter says the journal had questions about methodology. He wanted to know if I would be willing to provide a third-party observation record. I wrote back that I would. What I didn't write, what I've been thinking about since that first morning in April 1893, when I stood at the fence line watching a woman walk her field before dawn and press her palm to soil that was giving up, is this. I went to that claim as the man they send before they send the foreclosure papers. I came as an instrument of a decision that had, practically speaking, already been made. I had a form to fill out and a mandate to be neutral and a lifetime of practice at recording facts without feeling their weight.